Good afternoon and welcome to our presentation and panel discussion this afternoon. My name is Mike Crosby. I am a professor of architecture at the University of Hartford and also the editor of Faith and Form magazine. Our panel discussion and our presentation today is going to focus on the spiritual in contemporary architecture. And our first panelist for the four-part series is Joan Soranno. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. The panels will be presented this fall and into next year, and we hope that you can join us for all four of them. So thank you for being here today. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about our first speaker, this afternoon's speaker. And I'm going to share my screen while I do that. So just hold on for a sec. And here we go. All right. So Joan Soranno is the vice president and a design principal of HGA Architects in Minnesota, an award-winning architect specializing in religious and cultural architecture. Joan's passion for design is evident in her work. With partner John Cook, she has created an in-house design studio that serves as an incubator for innovative design. Joan is the recipient of the 2018 Edward J. Fry Award, which recognizes architects for their contributions to the field of religious architecture. Her notable projects include the entry pavilion for the Walker Art Center, which was awarded the 2021 AIA Architecture Award. She is also the designer for the Lakewood Cemetery Garden Mausoleum that we see here, which will be the focus of her presentation. And this project received the 2014 AIA Architecture Award and the 2013 American Society of Landscape Architects Award for Excellence. She's also designed the education and lobby expansion for Temple Israel and Bigelow Chapel for the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, which received the 2006 AIA Architecture Award. Joan has served as a juror for national award programs and has presented programs at major forums, including Constructing the Ineffable, Contemporary Sacred Architecture at Yale University, Innovative Uses of Wood to Evoke a Sense of Spirituality at Religious Facilities at MIT, and The Here and the Hereafter at the Catholic University of America. Joan studied architecture at the University of Notre Dame and is a member of the GSA Design Excellence Program National Peer. Her work has been published in the New York Times, Architectural Record, AIA Architect, and Architect Magazine. Please join me in welcoming Joan Soranno.
Thanks, Mike. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak with everybody today. I'm going to share my screen. So as Mike said, I'm going to talk about, hold on just a minute. I'm going to talk about the Lakewood Cemetery Garden Mausoleum project. And I've spoken about this project quite a bit. And I always start by defining what a mausoleum is. When John and I started to pursue this project, I wasn't quite sure myself. So simply put, it's a building that houses crypts, which are for full body burial in caskets, and columbarium niches for cremated remains. Now, you might be wondering, why would anybody want to be buried inside a mausoleum? And there are many personal reasons for that, but a very practical one is that in a cold weather climate like Minnesota, It's just a lot more comfortable for family members to visit loved ones inside the comfort of a building versus trudging through 10 feet of snow. When we pursued the project, we absolutely had no mausoleum experience. So I did quite a bit of research prior to the interview on cemetery design, funerary symbolism, and memorial architecture. And probably the most influential project for me, which I studied at school, is Woodlands Chapel in Stockholm, Sweden, designed by Asplund in 1920. And this project illustrates the incredible integration of sacred architecture with landscape. We also looked at ancient burial mounds and Etruscan burial tombs, and both of these examples illustrate the importance that landscape has always played in shaping funerary architecture. Lakewood Cemetery is in South Minneapolis between two city lakes, Lake Calhoun and Lake Harriet. And if you study cemetery typology, it's technically categorized as a lawn plan cemetery. And this is characterized by sweeping lawns, open canopy of trees, vertical monuments, water, and winding roads. Lakewood Cemetery is about 250 acres, and it was established in 1871. And like a lot of historic cemeteries, it doesn't have any room to grow. There's only 25 acres in this area here that aren't used. So we chose an underutilized site next to an existing 1960s mausoleum. This site is a bowl-shaped site, the low point being along this axis, and there was a hill going up to the north and a hill going to the south. We chose the North Hill as our site, mainly to take advantage of south-facing windows, but also closer to the main road. One of the striking characteristics about this site is that there's a 17-foot grade difference between what we called the garden level and the street level. You can see the beautiful mature oak trees on our site, and you can also see Lakewood Chapel in the background. And Lakewood Chapel is this extraordinary piece of architecture built in 1905. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and the insides were actually designed by a New York architect, Charles Lamb, and he designed these beautiful mosaics. There's over 10 million little pieces of stone and glass lining every surface of this chapel. In pre-design, I think there was an expectation on the client's part that we were going to take this 25,000 square foot building and string it along the site on 2 levels. And when we started studying that in models, we realized that that street level mass of building would be far too intrusive on the historic landscape. So the first move we made in pre-design was to actually propose tucking 3/4 of the building program, virtually all the crypt and columbarium rooms, into this north hillside with a green roof above it. Now, at the time for the first design meeting, this was a radical idea to present to the client because there are a lot of people that specifically want to be buried inside a mausoleum because they don't want to be buried into the ground, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. So what you're left with at the street level is a very small 5,000 square foot entry pavilion nestled amongst these oak trees. So at the garden level, what you see is this alternating rhythm of crypt and columbarium rooms that stretch out across the east. And then on the west, it's anchored by a small committal chapel. Above all of this at the street level is a green roof with that small entry pavilion. We broke the mass, this very long mass, into discrete parts to create, to reduce the scale of the building, and there's no wall at this garden level higher than 17 feet. So the building has a nice relationship and scale to the scale of a human body. It took us a while to understand what a funerary building, having never done one before, what it should look like. And because so much of contemporary architecture is about kind of minimalism and transparency, we started out developing these glass cubes that could be the crypt rooms with a cantilevered terrace. We started to try to defy the weight of the canopy by minimizing the edge. But at this point in the process, we kind of all were like, you know, this could be a museum, this could be a library. It doesn't look like anything that should be in Lakewood. The breakthrough came when we started to think about these masses, these crypt rooms, not as crystalline shapes, but as heavy, solid, rooted forms with deep recessive openings. So we started to take these recessive openings and manipulate them to create interesting shadowing across the facades, which we got kind of excited about. And then we also started to explore that once you develop these deep recesses, maybe there's a contrasting material inside that recess that reflects what's going on beyond. And we also explored ways to make each crypt room different from one another so the building doesn't look so uniform or bland, which is kind of a character defining feature of a lot of mausoleums. Mausoleums are interesting buildings to design because they're buildings that will last forever. These buildings will never be torn down because there's people buried inside of them. So obviously, long-lasting materials was really key. And stone was, we understood to be kind of the default material. Now, Lakewood has a standard that all headstones have to be granite, and there was an expectation we would use granite. I would say I spent a couple of months kind of trying to figure out another stone to use because granite is a very flat, uniform stone, but we got around that by using two different types of granite, a California and a Minnesota, that created a little bit more variation. Besides the granite, the other predominant exterior material are white mosaics. And as I mentioned, Charles Lamb designed these beautiful mosaics for the chapel. So we really just continued this legacy of mosaic work at Lakewood and developed these white monochromatic exterior mosaics using glass tile and Carrara marble. The pattern derived was from both geometric and natural form in a very abstract pattern that gets less dense as you move up the wall. So the mosaics are used to line these deep recesses and denote important moments inside the building, like the crypt room on the left and the committal chapel on the right. One of the other things about a mausoleum is that although these buildings are very expensive to build, they're actually a very efficient use of space. So when this mausoleum is full, there'll be over 10,000 people buried here, and the mausoleum takes up only a half of an acre. If you did an equivalent in-ground burial for 10,000 people, it would cover over 7 acres. The floor plan at the lower level is a very simple organization. It's just a double loaded corridor with crypt and columbarium rooms on the north and the south. The rooms to the north that are buried into the hill are illuminated by large skylights, and the rooms to the south are illuminated by south-facing windows. One interesting thing we learned about designing mausoleums, you can never combine crypts and columbarium niches together in one room because some religions and cultures are very much against cremation. So you tend to keep those things separate. There's a small committal chapel kind of on the west end here. And this chapel seats about 45 people. And this is a very solemn, very private room because this is where family members generally say goodbye to their loved ones in the form of a committal ceremony. So what we did at the south windows was we angled the jambs in such a way that if somebody is out in the garden, they can't directly see people inside, but it still allows light to come into the room. The chapel was the one space that we weren't necessarily required to use stone. It's just a simple oak floor, plaster walls, and plaster ceilings to create a very warm, intimate space. one of the interesting things on this project is we paid really close attention to not only the physical characteristics of materials, but the emotional ones. So if you think of stone, stone is it's a beautiful material. All architects want to use stone, but it's also very hard and it's very cold. And so in a room like this, that's very solemn and very private, the idea of softer, warmer materials made a lot of sense to us. The garden level corridor linking all the crypt and columbarium rooms together is long. It's about 180 feet long. So we modulated its length by this alternating rhythm of light and shadow. And one of the things that we did to try to create this spiritual environment is conceal all devices, lighting. I'm happy to say there's been no photoshopping on any of these photos, and the architects in the room know it's very hard to hide those things, but we tried to keep the surfaces as uncluttered as possible. When we suggested in the first design meeting that we were going to bury all the crypt and columbarium rooms into this north hill, we said the success of this project was going to depend on how much light, natural light, we could harvest into these subterranean rooms. So along the north are a series of skylights, and these skylights are in different locations from room to room. So as you're going down that hallway, the light level from room to room is dramatically different. The skylights let in a huge amount of light on that north side. In fact, the rooms on the north are brighter and lighter than the rooms facing facing south. One crypt fits into this rectangle here, and then what's called the shutter, which is the marble face, is inscribed with a name and a date. The two recesses in the back are family crypt rooms, so families can purchase this for their own private use. And then you can see the skylight is manifested in the green roof on the right, these earthen mounds that mark the sacred rooms below. The entire garden level is a concrete frame, including the crypt cells that you see here. So one casket would fit into this cell. And crypts are a lot fussier. They're a lot more expensive than a columbarium niche. They take up 27 times more space. Each one of these cells has an individual separate vent and drain, and I'll leave it up to your imagination what that's for. And if you don't have a proper seal between this concrete and the shutter, you have a very bad infestation of bugs. So they're tricky spaces to detail right. The predominant interior material is a white Alabama marble, and this really optimizes the light reflectivity inside these subterranean rooms. An interesting note about this is that it was cheaper for us to quarry in Alabama and ship all the stone to Italy to fabricate than it was to fabricate in Tennessee. In the mausoleum world, you realize these buildings are incredibly sacred, incredibly spiritual, but they're really about retail, and buyers want variety. So each of the rooms has a different ceiling shape and a different color of flooring. So imagine if the whole mausoleum was this pink onyx. Somebody comes in and they say their least favorite color is pink. They've basically lost a sale. Burial trends in America are moving away from casket burial to cremation, I think over 60%. So the majority of what they call inventory is cremation, for cremation. So there's 4,800 niches and 750 crypts. So this is a columbarium room. So each one of these rectangles can hold up to 2 urns. The most expensive level is what's called the eye and heart level. And that's the level where standing, you can very easily touch the name and the shutter itself. And then prices go down or go down as you move up or move down. You can see the skylight. We were very much influenced by the artist James Turrell. And so the skylight frame is recessed, so you can't see it. There's just this very simple plaster knife edge. So when you look up, it looks like there's nothing between you and the sky above. The South Crypt rooms, pristinely framed views to a new garden we designed. And like the skylights, the window frame is recessed. So it looks like the wall is framing the view, not the window frame itself. We also kind of obsessively studied the material finishes. So the hallway with the dark granite is split face. The walls are honed, so they're not reflecting anything around it. But you can see the onyx floors are highly polished to reflect not only the garden, but also light. And although the north rooms very much have a focus upwards towards the sky, you can see long views to this new garden. One interesting tidbit, we presented 3 different colors of flooring, the onyx. There was a green, a honey, and a pink. And the building committee initially rejected the pink. There were mostly older men on the building committee, and they said nobody would be caught dead, no pun intended, in a pink room. Later, the sales staff we were talking to, and they said, oh, the pink would be so popular because 80% of all buyers are women. So the building committee reconsidered, they let us use the pink, and sure enough, 2 to 1, the pink is outselling the green and the honey. We worked really closely with a Boston landscape firm, Halverson Design Partners, and we designed the garden is organized around a large central lawn with a reflecting pool that reinforces the axes between the chapel and the 1960s mausoleum. And on Memorial Day, which is their most popular day, there can be upwards of 3,500 people here. We also designed a zero edge reflecting pool. And what this means is that basically there's 1 inch of water floating above granite pavers. And we did that so that when the pool is drained in November because of the cold weather, it doesn't look like an empty basin, but just an extension of the granite pavers around it. We were fortunate to be able to afford to plant very large caliber trees. These are 8-inch maples. So when the building opened, we kind of had an instant landscape, which was great. One of the core ideas on this project was to develop a really strong sense of intimacy between the visitor, the architecture, and the landscape. So when people arrive at the street level, all they see is this small entry pavilion nestled in this grove of oak trees with a deep recess that draws people in. And this idea of really thick walls and deep recesses, we kept coming back to time and time again, not only to evoke a feeling of permanence and solidity, but also create interesting shadows across the facade, which if you work in this building type, architects for centuries have used shadows as metaphors for death. If anybody's ever been into a mausoleum, most of them are pretty dark, introverted spaces. So we kind of inverted that paradigm, large windows that lets in lots of daylight and frames really beautiful views of this historic cemetery. It's really interesting to design a building, again, that you know will never be torn down, and that stone, you've got to use stone everywhere. But where we could, we incorporated wood, in this case mahogany, into most of the rooms to just create a little bit of more warmth and softness to these very hard surfaces. You can also see a clear story window here that illuminates the path down into the burial rooms. And the section we paid really close attention to, so that when people enter the building and start to go down the stair into these sacred rooms, the light from above is indirect. You can't see the light source, which is usually identified with a more spiritual, more godly type of light. When people use the stair to exit, you can look out the clerestory windows to the sky, to the trees, and reconnect back with your life. The green roof above the crypt and columbarium rooms is just a very simple lawn plane, which is an extension of the cemetery plane, which makes sense because it's a lawn planned cemetery. Again, the character defining feature are these lawns. The skylights, doors, and windows are all bronze, and we picked bronze over stainless steel or aluminum because it's a material that patinas over time. It's marking time, and this idea of commemorative architecture doing that made a lot of sense to us. And throughout the 4 years that we worked on this project, I think we all felt a huge responsibility to not only preserve and strengthen this cherished place in the Twin Cities, but also design a building that could stand the test of time. So what I'd like to do to end the presentation today is show a short video that we did right after the building was completed. And I think it gives you a good sense of kind of the feel of this place.
Joan, thank you so much for that presentation. It is an absolutely stunning work of architecture, and it's wonderful that we could share some time with you and end this beautiful building. Congratulations on such an achievement. It's pretty amazing. Before I introduce our four panelists, I would like to say a few words about the people and the institutions that are sponsoring today's event. So the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity in Transition, together with the Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality Forum, are the sponsors for this afternoon's program. The Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality Forum is an international organization that supports research, practice, education, and advocacy on the significance, experience, and meanings of the built environment. Founded in 2007, ACSF holds annual symposia at places with spiritual significance. It publishes research, and it maintains a website as an open source scholarly archive and produces a bi-monthly newsletter. It also supports scholars, practitioners, and students through annual grants, award programs, and scholarships. It is the only organization of its type that directly addresses the spiritual and cultural aspects of built environments. The Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke, the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, and the Center on Modernity in Transition are proud to partner with ACSF to help amplify its vision through this speaker series on spirituality in contemporary architecture. And now I would like to introduce our panelists that will be with us for the rest of the afternoon. And we're going to start with Francis Halsband. Francis is the founding partner of Clement Halsband Architects, which is a New York City firm focusing on design and transformation of structures in historic settings. Francis was Dean of the Architecture School at Pratt Institute and Commissioner of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. She also has designed several works of architecture for faith communities. Tom Fisher is a professor in the School of Architecture and director of the Minnesota Design Center at the College of Design at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. A former dean and editor of Progressive Architecture magazine, he's written 3 books on ethics and the built environment. His architect grandfather practiced for more than 80 years designing religious buildings. So Tom grew up visiting myriad spiritual spaces. Carla Britton is professor of art history at Dene College in Arizona, the tribal college of the Navajo Nation, where she also oversees grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and Art Place America on Native Arts and Indigenous Design. She has written and published extensively on the topic of sacred architecture. And then finally, we have Jay Price, who directs the local and community history program at Wichita State University. Among his publications is Temples for a Modern God, Religious Architecture in Post-War America. Jay's recent projects include a graphic novel that tells the story of the community through the eyes of a Longhorn named Luke, and Somosas de Wichita, a study of the local Latino community. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. We're looking forward to a great discussion. And what I would like to do is start off and ask each one of you for your sort of initial reactions and observations about the Mausoleum project, and what's some of the things that occurred to you as Joan was sharing her project with us. Jay, do you want to start off?
Sure, thank you very much. It was really a privilege to be able to see the thought process behind something like this. Thinking about how one uses a space like that even a mausoleum or a columbarium is itself somewhat unusual, I think now, for how a lot of people, especially younger generations, are thinking about this. So I was really intrigued by the different layers of meaning. Looking at the mounds, for example, there's almost a hearkening back to the tombs of Northern Europe in the Bronze Age, and there's a antiquities definite connection, which I think was really beautiful. My question as I'm thinking about it is, how are these spaces going to be used as a place of visitation? Because it's not a one use time for a lot of people. And I'm thinking especially from the Latino community, where Day of the Dead is so important, or a yard site is important for the Jewish community. And so I'm curious how a space like this is going to be used over time, particularly for cultures and traditions where regular visitation are going to be part of the conversation. So I think that's something that will be intriguing to observe and see how people interact with the space. And I kept one question in the back of my mind for the architect. If she were to choose this as her final resting place, what space would she want?
Do you want me to answer that now or wait?
Oh, yeah, we would love to hear your impressions on that. Yeah.
So John and I are going to be buried there. And that it's actually a kind of an interesting story. During the design process, we always kind of toyed with the idea of putting a columbarium niche in the floor, maybe like a pope, you know, in the St. Peter's. So kind of the only floor niche, but we never got around to that. One day during construction, John, we did a lot of light studies, especially for the north with the skylights, to understand how light was going to move through each one of these spaces. And we did quite a bit, but we did not anticipate one moment, which only happens 2 times a year, in one of the rooms, because the skylight and the cone of the skylights are in different locations. But in one of these rooms with the skylight, the light hits the corner around noon, and it basically, it's very corny, but it basically casts a huge heart in the corner. It takes up the entire corner of the room is a giant heart, which again, we did not anticipate this. And this was before it was just concrete. And so we decided at that moment, it's like, we don't care what the color of the floor is. We don't care what the shape of the ceiling is. We're going to be kind of in that light twice a year. So that's where we will be buried. And, you know, this project, we were also married at Lakewood Chapel during the project. And we live about 5 minutes away from Lakewood Cemetery. So it's one of those rare cases where, you know, it's so profoundly meaningful and close to us, this project, in ways well beyond the project itself. And Jay, your comment about the different cultures celebrating, we have seen many interesting scenes over the years, like a Buddhist ceremony happening in one of the rooms. You know, it is a ecumenical or non-denominational mausoleum. What's interesting is the mausoleum that was designed in the 1960s, the cemetery has always been non-sectarian and non-denominational. But in the 1960s, what that meant were stained glass windows with Jesus and the apostles. which is funny, right? But in the 60s, nobody thought, so needless to say, there are no images, no iconography, no overt symbols of any kind of particular religion. So, so I think it is a very inclusive building, and they're very flexible in terms of what happens in those rooms on any given day.
Joan, that's a great story about the heart and the light. It's just pretty amazing. It's one of these things that your design teaches you something that you didn't know was there, and it's inherent in the fabric of the building. Francis, I would love to get some of your impressions on Joan's presentation and the mausoleum.
I think I've been on a couple of awards juries that have given awards to Joan's work, so I'm delighted to meet her in person, compliment her on her work. And I hope that you won't take my comments as negative, but rather as questioning the whole world that we find ourselves living in. I want to pick up a little bit on what Jay said about how is the space used, and a little bit on what you said when you said, needless to say, there are no religious objects in this space. And I just wonder, since I believe we're talking, I guess we're talking about religion as well as architecture, and you've done a building for no religion, but for a group that puts it all together. But I just, I wonder how this much abstraction turns out to be appropriate when people in religious spaces do look for some objects, some icons, some things they can identify with. I was struck with the level of abstraction, and in fact, there's no art of any sort in this space. There's certainly beautiful decoration, but there's nothing that I would call art. I was struck with the fact that there was no furniture, and following up what Jay was saying, like where does a person sit down? What if you want to be in the space, in one of those spaces? There were some benches, but I think, no arms on the benches. So people of an age that I anticipate are going to be there are going to have trouble standing up and staying there. The level of abstraction is also about the uniformity of the names. I assume that everybody has to use the same type for their name. So there isn't even a way to create any personal expression, let alone any religious expression. And so that level of abstraction, while it produces spaces of extraordinary beauty, I really wonder how that fits in with some of the other human themes that we think of when we think of death.
Yeah, it's a really good observation and comment. One of the things we did a benchmarking tour before we designed this with the client. We actually went out east, saw several cemeteries and mausoleums in New York, in Boston, in Connecticut, and our mausoleum consultant was really pushing for glass-fronted niches, because people can, customize the urns, they can customize what goes into these glass-fronted niches. And when the president of the cemetery looked at it, although people love it, what you see is like crinkled photos because they're not taken care of. There's dust everywhere. It's just like all these tchotchkes, and it looks very chaotic. It doesn't look very peaceful. So his comment was, we're going to keep it a lot more quiet and simple so that other things like the light or the beauty of the garden kind of resonates. So it's not so much about the individual, it's about these larger experiences. Again, most mausoleums built today have glass-fronted niches for that very reason, being able to personalize each one. They tend to look a little as an architect and aesthetically, they tend to look busy and a little chaotic. But it's a really good question about symbols. We did a chapel several years ago for the United Church of Christ, which are very, they honor all styles of worship. Well, the big debate in the chapel was, do we show a cross?
Mm.
If we're going to, invite everybody to worship here, should that cross show up?
Mhm.
And after a lot of debate, a lot of people said, no, it should not show up. It did show up. They said, we're rooted in UCC.
Mm.
So, we've got to kind of adhere to that, to those roots. But to others, that symbol is very polarizing. So it's a really interesting topic.
Mhm. Yes. Tom, would you, Tom Fisher, please share with us, I know one of the people besides Joan here who's actually been to the mausoleum, has visited it, wrote a really wonderful article for our journal, Faith and Form. Could you share some of your impressions from Joan's presentation?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Yes, it's one of the most powerful works of architecture I know. I go there frequently. I mean, usually when people are visiting, I take them to the mausoleum, which seems strange that, come to Minneapolis and let's go to the cemetery. But it's such a powerful work. On this question, just before I talk a little bit about what it feels like to be there, I make a distinction between religion and spirituality, and it's an incredibly spiritual place, even though there are no overt symbols of religion. And I think that's an important distinction to make. I also make a distinction between personalization and the universality of death, because in a way, when you think about what spiritual spaces are about, and spirituality is largely helping us deal with death and its transcendence, right? And so to me, this is a profoundly spiritual place, even though it's not overtly religious at all. And what I find so fascinating about is, and Jay, you made this point, the layers of meaning. For example, in the landscape, we're on Dakota land, and the Dakota had burial mounds. In fact, there's a whole series of burial mounds along the Mississippi. And the raised mounds that Joan and John have put in this landscape sort of recall the idea that we're on Dakota land. We're actually, we took their land, right? And so there's this interesting dialogue between the pavilion building, the kind of European notion of architecture and of death, and the Dakota way in which death was about returning to the land. There's also this really fascinating sense when you're there about going from life to death. So you enter this pavilion, and the pavilion has reception rooms and toilets and kitchens and sort of the things of life. And then you descend down into the ground, this idea of, sort of experientially dying. And yet what's fascinating about it, as Joan has said, is that down there, it's brighter. There's this illumination. And so there's this sense of you look out into this garden of kind of the garden of earthly delight, right? There's this sense that even though you've died, you're entering a new kind of world, a new landscape that you didn't see when you come upon the building. So it's a kind of hidden garden that you only see once you're in it, in the building. And then the skylights, the sense that you're dealing with death, but there's all of this light coming from above. So this idea of transcendence. And I mean, Joan and John are so brilliant in just the way they detail even the stone. I mean, this idea of the granite as like a sedimentary layer. So it's laid up in the series, these long, thin bars, as if you're going down through the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's contrasted with this marble onyx, which is veined. It's like the human skin. And so there's this sense of both descending into the ground, and yet you come into this womb-like space, this veined space. And so there's all of these sort of echoing of life and death, and of transcendence, and of there, being some life after death, which I think is just incredibly profound about the experience of being there. And even for people I know who aren't planning on being buried there, or don't know of anyone being buried there, they visit the mausoleum. It's this place of incredible calm, and it really gets one thinking about you know, sort of the bigger questions of life, which I think is what all spiritual spaces should do.
Mhm. Joan, what are your responses to Tom's observations?
I think a lot of what Tom is talking about is everything that we were talking about at the time of designing this.
Mhm.
You know, I think a lot of architects maybe would not have made the choice to make basically 3/4 of this building invisible
Mm.
to the street. Because again, the client really thought we were going to do a 2-story building, and that up at that street level, that the crypt and columbarium rooms were going to be very dominant and very visible. So as the cemetery president said, as a family goes down the road, they can point and say, grandma's buried there. So the fact that the first design idea was to actually make that invisible to the street was something that, again, it's a testament to the client that they actually had a certain amount of trust in us that would work, because they were thinking, if you can't see it, people won't know it or understand it. And to say, you know, we didn't want to destroy the views to the chapel. We didn't want to destroy those oak trees.
Yes.
It was a radical concept that I think for those of us that have clients, most clients would not have kind of gone down that road with us. So it was pretty extraordinary that they did.
Mhm. So this was really a learning process. Well, like most projects, this was really a learning process between the architect and the client in terms of understanding and surprising the client in a way, which I think is always probably a good thing when you're a designer, to be able to do that, you know?
Well, and I think that one of the things that I have said a lot, and that we thought it throughout the process, was, I mean, I'm an architect. Architecture is extraordinary. And as extraordinary as architecture can be, it's hard to compete with nature. It's hard to compete with the beauty of a single tree. So we kind of had that. And if you think about most people that come to cemeteries, what they want, what they need, that idea of a beautiful place surrounded by nature, it kind of drove our thinking throughout this entire process.
Mhm.
And the landscape designer was very happy with that, because I think they were thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
And when they, you know, and they were actually on the selection committee, they were hired before us. So I think they were relieved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Carla, would you share with us some of your impressions from Joan's presentation and the mausoleum?
Yes, thank you very much for including me, and thank you for your presentation. So I wanted to follow up with what you have just said, that, you know, people were looking for a beautiful place, and that's really what you aimed for. And I was just curious if there are any anti-pastoral moments in this place. That's my first question. I mean, are there places that perhaps speak of the dissonance of death, of that kind of irreconcilable fissure that happens when someone close to you dies, where there's that sense of division or ultimate rupture? So that's my first question. Is I was just very curious if there are any moments that speak of the anti-pastoral in the project. And then my second question, I guess, is the why now question. There's, you know, the staggering milestone that we all passed yesterday of over 700,000 deaths in the US from the coronavirus. And so I was just very curious if this environment as a whole reflects or resonates for you on this historical moment. So those are my two questions.
Good questions.
Yeah, great question. So anti-pastoral moments. I think as you're describing it, probably not, because if you think of it's a simple building in terms of program. It's crypt and columbarium rooms. Ones are illuminated by the sky, the others illuminated and focused on the garden. And then, as Tom said, the first floor is the communal. There's one thing I didn't really talk about is there's a large reception area that is now used for the entire cemetery. So when there's a memorial service at the chapel and they need a place to have lunch or coffee, the mausoleum on that first floor is really the communal, and the lower level is kind of the more individual.
Mhm.
Talked a lot about acoustics in this. Upstairs, where you've got the communal, it's a sensitivity to the demographic, and the sound is muted. The sound is absorbed. When it's more about the individual, the sound is amplified. So all of the hard surfaces, you actually hear your foot fall as
Yes.
you're going down the hallway.
Yes.
So it's kind of that relationship between yourself and your loved one that just passed. Things like that, thinking about the sound and your footfall amplifies that.
Mhm.
So again, I didn't really talk about that, but again, the first floor is communal, lower level is kind of about the individual and its relationship with the person that's passed. But that idea of the division or the separation, the only metaphor, the only idea maybe that clear story that I was talking about, the clear story window at the stair. And we really encourage the elevator is very close by. Most people go down the stair. So the idea of the stair as you're going down, having that spiritual light, and then as you're going up, you've broken with that spiritual moment and you're looking out the window and reconnecting with your life.
Mhm.
That's the only thing I can think of in terms of that break. We did think a lot about threshold and the idea of crossing over.
Yes.
So that's what I would say about that. And then the response regarding kind of the time that we're in with COVID, I don't know, I don't have a good answer in terms of the mausoleum, but I do know that the cemetery is, I mean, as anybody that works in this field knows, that cemeteries are hurting right now. Most people, because of the cremation, before cremation, full body burial and caskets, people had to do something. They had to go to the cemetery and bury their loved ones. Now with cremation, you can put somebody on the mantle for decades, right? So cemeteries are struggling to figure out how to stay relevant and stay serving the community. And one of the things Lakewood is doing really well is outreach. And so they're doing things like getting an artist in to do beautiful mandalas in the landscape with found objects like flowers and twigs and these beautiful large mandalas. They've got a lantern ceremony that they do each year. They've got a lake and they float these lanterns that people decorate. So they're doing a lot of they're trying to do a lot of outreach that welcomes the community in. People that are grieving, they've got a lot of classes now about death and dying. So they've been doing a lot more outreach than I would say when we were doing it even, to try to stay, again, relevant and still an important part of the community. I mean, cemeteries around the turn of the century, were the public parks. So people hung out at the cemetery over, on weekends. They pick a, have a lunch, a picnic, and spend the day at the cemetery. We're kind of death phobic right now. So people don't want to go into the cemetery. Lakewood's trying to change that perception.
Interesting. Interesting. Francis, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm just, as you're talking about this, I understand that you have a client with very specific ideas about things. And so this is really a question about your client, that if somebody wants to come in with a rose on the day that somebody died, will they let them? If a Jewish person wants to come in and place a stone, will they let them? Or is really a lot of the, I'm going to call it regimentation of this place comes about because of the rules of the place, that if you want to remain close to someone who's died, which is a part of Carla's question, you probably won't have that person buried in this place.
Okay, so Francis, I probably have not made this clear enough. So Lakewood, the only thing that they ban at Lakewood is fake flowers. You can't have fake flowers.
That's a good thing to ban, actually.
They only want real flowers, which it's funny because out east, they actually don't, a lot of cemeteries don't allow real flowers inside. They only want fake. So Lakewood, the only thing you can't bring into the mausoleum is fake flowers. Mm-hmm. So in the room, and the photography probably didn't portray it well enough, there are benches and there are flower tables. Mm-hmm. And there are holes around the edge of the floor for vases that the cemetery supplies. So if you go into those rooms on any given day, what's really wonderful is the smell of all the flowers. Mm-hmm. The flowers are everywhere. And they do a really good job of not letting them, when they die, they take them away. So there's not like dead flowers in with fresh flowers. Yes. There's cards, there's toys, there's mementos kind of strewn all around the rooms. So it's not, yes, the photos are pristine, mm-hmm. But the rooms actually are not. And
thank you for that.
Yeah.
For the people at this conference who are not familiar with the way architects operate, it's very, very typical for architects to want to take photographs of their buildings before any human being has interacted with the building at all. So,
and I would say, Mike, that even since Lakewood opened, our philosophy about photography is completely different. Mm-hmm. It is done a 180. So we would, if we were shooting Lakewood now, those photos would not be so pristine. Yes. But it's a tricky thing with when you're talking about a mausoleum and people grieving.
Yes.
A lot of people don't really want to be on display, and then you're staging stuff. So
yes.
It's a tough conversation.
Yes, yes. I was interested in the fact that you looked at Asplin's work at Woodland, and you and your clients visited some cemeteries and mausoleums here in the Northeast. Were there any other kinds of environments that you visited to address the question or the quest for spirituality in this building? Did you look at something else that was not part of the cemetery building type that you learned from and applied into this building in terms of the quest for spirituality here?
That's a really good question. I think probably, nothing specifically. There have been projects that have had a huge impact, like Stephen Hole's chapel, St. Ignatius. There are contemporary examples that just the way Stephen Hole uses light
Yes.
It's really incredible. And having basically our first religious project was in 2004 with Bigelow Chapel. And I remember going to St. Ignatius before that project, and just the power of light to create, the sense of the spiritual
Yes.
had a huge impact. But I do think that, I had the good fortune of growing up in Milan, Italy, and spending 7 years there, and just being around, I've always loved churches. Can't tell you how many countless hours I've spent in the Duomo in Milan.
Yes.
And as a kid, you kind of just absorb these things. So
it's deep inside there, and you just can still touch it. Yes.
Well, another aspect of Hull's work, which I think, Joan, is so evident and so powerful at the Mausoleum, is the way in which you hide like the window frames, or the light, there's a cove lighting, so you don't really have light fixtures. Stephen Hull does that on a lot of his buildings, brings things to a kind of a knife edge. And so many aspects of the Mausoleum are so interesting in that regard, because on one hand, it seems very heavy and rooted in the ground, and yet the edges are almost, knife edge. They're almost invisible. And so there's this play between massiveness and seemingly ephemerality, which again is this kind of life-death conversation that goes on throughout the whole building.
Jay, is there something you want to share?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating discussion, and I've been noticing some conversation about it being a quiet, reflective space and a place for personal connection, which is so much a part of this tradition. But I'm also wondering, for example, the overstepping back from religious tradition makes somewhat sense, because if you're truly part of a religious tradition today, chances are the service is going to be at a house of worship or in the home, or however and so my experience with these types of events and life events is they tend to be inherently secular. They tend to be more tied to people who don't have a faith community. And so I think that makes sense to have that more neutral space to an extent. But my one big question on this is, there are traditions and cultures where expressions of grief and memory and so forth are not quiet. They are, in fact, joyous, exuberant,
Right.
Loud and boisterous, and that's how you mark this passage. How does this space respond to that need without creating a cacophony that I could see being very disorienting and discordant?
That's a great question, Jay, and it's something we did. It's something we talked a lot about. So the first level is the reception room, and that reception area that can seat about 120 people. That reception room also is adjacent to an outdoor terrace that overlooks the pool and the garden. So the idea is that we talked about this a lot, that first floor place is this place of celebration, the coming together. We talked a lot about whether they were going to allow wedding receptions in this reception, because they talked a lot about like alcohol, and that alcohol and commemoration just doesn't, quite work, but they would allow a reception without alcohol. So that first floor is kind of the raucous, celebratory, coming together to honor, your loved ones. The lower level is the quieter level. So it's kind of bisected, and it's separated acoustically. So you can have a raucous, celebration on the first floor, and you really can't hear it on the second floor or the lower level. One thing I do want to note, and this is an interesting conversation, throughout the mausoleum, we designed a sound system with speakers that kind of sit above the ceiling. I'm sure the architects understand this. Sound is transmitted, so you don't see speakers, but you can literally have music, a wall of sound in every single room, first floor, lower level. And when John and I were punching the building out, we brought some Gregorian chants, because to us, this is our world.
Yes.
And we would spend 8 hours a day with this music just echoing off the walls throughout the building. It was a profound experience. Now, fast forward to when they opened, the president of the cemetery got something off of Apple iTunes. It was like Muzak. And at one point, no vocal, but like just this kind of sappy music. And to the point where Wind Beneath My Wings, that if people are aware of that.
Yes.
Apparently a musician from the Minnesota Orchestra went through the building, wrote the president a letter and said, you know, profound experience. If you don't turn off that music, you're going to just destroy, you know, the whole tone or feel of the, so music, you realize, was really polarizing. And admittedly, it was bad music. But if you're designing one question I have is, if you're designing a place for all, how do you pick music? And the musician said, just transmit sounds like water, wind, something tied to the earth, as opposed to music, because you realize music is so locked into culture.
Absolutely.
And so they haven't had music since. They don't use the music, they don't use the sound system.
So what we're really hearing is that this building absolutely beautifully captures what a segment of the population believes is spirituality and death, and does not welcome diverse cultures with different points of view, whether it's about music or whether it's about you know, putting your own little pot of flowers in front of a grave. And this is not a criticism of what you've done, or maybe it's a criticism of your clients, I don't know. But I think we must realize, as part of this conversation, that there are many, many other ways to think about spirituality and to think about death. I mean, I'm on the board of a little local cemetery in Woodstock, New York. So you can imagine, it's Woodstock, New York. We're now doing green burials. And the idea of a green burial is that eventually someone else gets buried in the same place. So this whole conversation about how do you bury somebody, we're in another place because it's Woodstock, it's another place. So I just think that we need to say at some moment in this conversation, yes, everything here is truly wonderful, but it's wonderful for a certain group of people and not for everyone. So I don't think you can say it welcomes everyone. I don't think you can say a certain kind of music goes with this place. No doubt about that.
I don't know, Francis. I mean, when I've been there, it's been a very diverse group of people. I mean, I've seen all sorts of people there. And as Joan said, there's a lot of things that are left. I mean, they don't show in the architectural photos that we saw, but there are a lot of, flowers and other mementos that are scattered around. I don't know. I mean, I actually think because of its abstraction, it actually is more accommodating of difference.
Yeah, and one thing I will say, if you read the markers, there's everyone. I mean, everyone is represented there. And Francis, they turned the music off. I mean, because they couldn't figure out what a sound could be transmitted that would be universal.
Yes.
Well, of course, because there's no such thing. That's exactly my point. Exactly my point.
Yeah.
To call abstraction universal.
The sound of nature is
universal. I think abstraction, it's accommodating. I mean, I'm not saying that abstraction is universal, but I think because of its abstractness, it's actually much more accommodating. Actually, another aspect of this we haven't mentioned, the circulation pattern works really well. I've been there so many times where I want to go down into the columbarium and there's some reception going on.
Yeah.
And, you know, you don't want to intrude on that family, but Joan allows you to come in the door and right down the stairs. And then the fact that there are all these separate rooms. So I've been there so many times where there's been different kinds of things going on in the different rooms. So the room quality is also allows for a variety of things to happen.
Yeah.
I do think
Mike,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to, just for the sake of conversation, maybe push back a little bit on this idea of a place that should be accommodating when you're talking about death. And I'm just wondering if there isn't room in spirituality for a kind of toughness. I mean, something that might be, you know, hair-raising tough, that you're really talking about rupture in a major way. And there's certainly examples of crematoria or mausoleums that do that. And I don't know if it would work, you know, in the American Midwest, given the clientele. I think this may go back to what Francis was saying, but certainly there are traditions where, you know, death is something that's very terrifying. And I'm just wondering if there isn't room for that as well.
Yeah, you're talking about basically memento mori. This idea that images are things that conjure up death.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, yes, clearly, I think this client was taking the step that, yes, for most Americans, death is a very scary thing culturally. And so how do you create a place of welcome where the people that are afraid of death aren't going to come here and just tense up?
Good point. I'd like to open this discussion actually with our audience. If you have a question that you would like to address to Joan or any of our panelists, please type it in the chat, and we'll respond to it. Joan, we do have a question that's already come in, which is because this is essentially a secular building, this is the question, because it was a secular building, it's not a building where rituals are performed, although they are, I imagine on some occasion. But how do you capture a sense of spirituality in a building that is really not built for a religious purpose like this one?
Well, again, I think it's just playing with these kind of universal things that we can use as architects that can evoke the spiritual, whether it's creative use of light. Again, as I mentioned, that idea of indirect light versus direct light.
Yes.
It has profoundly indirect light used well, can conjure up the spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
Nature conjures up the spiritual. A lot of it's about transcendence.
Yes.
Beauty, I mean, beauty is a bad word in most circles, but I think beauty is also something, again, that can get to this idea of the spiritual.
Okay. All right. I also wanted to ask our attendees this afternoon, you can also hit that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you want to ask a question as well. I have another question from our audience, which was, what impact did the weather, the climate in Minnesota have on this building, in terms of if you were designing this building perhaps for Arizona, what did you do in Minnesota that really was had a huge impact in terms of the seasons and so forth on this building?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of them was the pool, because the pool has to be drained. We've all seen drained pools, basins that get filled with dead leaves and dirt, and so again, that zero, that zero edge reflecting pool.
Yes.
When it's off, it just looks like part of the granite patio, which is great. I mean, obviously we did double glazed glass everywhere, so the construction itself is sound. One thing that I did not talk about, but the life of mausoleums have a finite amount of years. You think, okay, they're going to last forever. But after a couple hundred years, the generations have died off and
Yeah.
visitorship gets really, really low. So one of the things we did do is that whole lower level can kind of be disconnected from a utility standpoint,
Ah,
so that, again, pipes won't freeze, and, they can somehow make that part of the building, the crypt and columbarium rooms, cold, and then still have heat and utilities for the reception above.
mm-hmm.
Because again, after 300 years, who is really visiting, unless there's a famous person there, who's really visiting it? So we kind of, thought about things like that. But the cold weather, I mean, again, I think, things like the pool, it's tricky detailing green roofs in Minnesota. But again, John, my husband, is done it a lot of times. So, I mean, those are the things I can think of.
It's actually quite lovely in winter with the snow. I mean, the granite, the way the snow falls on the granite walls. I mean, it's really a beautiful place to visit in the middle of winter.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the color choices and the materials work very, very differently when everything is white instead of the green carpet or the grass, I imagine. I mean, it's a very different kind of aesthetic experience, I would imagine.
It's very monochrome.
Yes.
And I mean, we have run into people that, they go every season because it changes so much because of that garden. And yeah, it's a very different feeling in the winter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Were there things that you drew upon in terms of evoking the sense of the spiritual in this building, that you that you had this idea of including it perhaps in the design, but decided not to? Was there anything that, I mean, it seems like the client had some very, very strong ideas about what they were looking for, although they were surprised with this idea of this building being underground.
Anything that, I can't think of anything offhand. I do know that, we worked with some younger designers.
Yes.
And the tension between John and I and the younger designers usually involved creating something that was provoking, that was provocative.
Ah, interesting.
And John and I wanting to tamp that down. Of feeling like, again, we work on museums. And museums, again, the idea of provocation is a good one. A mausoleum, not so much. Just feeling like understanding the type of people coming here. The idea that the architecture somehow would provoke doesn't seem like the proper tone or feel.
Yes.
And then the other thing we thought a lot about, and again, I would only know this being an older designer doing a mausoleum, is one of the younger, incredibly talented designers, Nick Potts, was helping us with the railing going down, to the burial rooms. And he had designed this beautiful kind of rectangular section with sharp corners.
Yes.
And I said, Nick, okay, beautiful, stunning, love to do it. But think of an 80-year-old woman with arthritis.
Yes.
Grabbing onto this handrail. What is this going to feel like in their hands?
Right.
So it's putting yourself in those people's shoes.
Right.
And not just being very careful that the architecture is not creating bad feelings for people.
All right. Carla, you probably wouldn't agree with that.
No, I mean,
insert a little bit of terror into this building. You could use a square handrail, I suppose. But
there's an interesting architectural history to this too. So Ralph Rapson actually won a Progressive Architecture Design Award for this mausoleum back, what, Joan, in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
It was never built, but it was a glass pavilion on a plinth across from the tradition, the chapel. And so just an interesting backstory there.
Yeah, we have another very interesting question from someone in our audience saying that how does your building address the idea of the people who are interred there, that they live on through us and they live on through our memories? How did you consider that issue when designing this building?
Well, only in the context of designing a place such that those people would want to come visit often.
Yes. Okay.
So that it's not some
Yeah.
kind of tomb that is empty and silent.
Yes.
And it's designing a place that it goes beyond just commemorating somebody that's died.
Yes.
It's actually a space that people want to be in.
Yes.
It brings life to that building.
Wonderful. And that's a wonderful way to end our discussion this afternoon. I really appreciate, Joan, your presentation. And I am very, very happy with our 4 panelists. Very provoking questions, very provoking comments, really great discussion. So thank you very much. And I want to invite all of our participants today to join us on November 6th, when we will have another presentation and discussion on spirituality and contemporary architecture. That'll be at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, same as today. And we will be joined by Siamak Harari, who designed the Baha'i Temple in Santiago, Chile. And he will be presenting that building. And we will have 4 new panelists as well. So thank you very, very much for being with us this afternoon. Great discussion and beautiful building. Congratulations, John.
Thank you,
Mike.
Thanks,
Joan.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.